Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast aimed at intermediate to advanced level English learners. In this episode of Thinking in English, I want to introduce you all to the weird language of English newspapers. Newspapers are full of words, vocabulary, grammar, and types of sentences that we don't normally use in everyday life. And for this reason, it can be difficult for English learners to understand journalism. Hopefully, by the end of this episode, you will have a clearer understanding of Journalese. But first, why not follow the Thinking in English Instagram page, Thinking in English podcast, or the link is in the description. And you definitely should look at our blog, thinkinginenglish.blog, for all transcripts and bonus content. Here is today's vocabulary list. As always, the written list is available in the description of the podcast and also on our blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. Tabloid. Tabloid. A tabloid is a type of popular newspaper with small pages that has many pictures and short, simple reports. For example, in the UK, The Sun is the most popular tabloid. Confrontation. Confrontation. A confrontation is a fight or argument, as in, there were violent confrontations between police and demonstrators. Intransitive verb. Intransitive verb. An intransitive verb is a verb which does not have or need an object. For example, in the sentence, I tried to persuade him, but he wouldn't come. Come is an intransitive verb. Intentionally. Intentionally. With a plan or purpose. For example, the company was accused of intentionally dumping garbage into the river. Ambiguous. Ambiguous. If something is ambiguous, it has or expresses more than one possible meaning, sometimes intentionally. For instance, his reply to my question was somewhat ambiguous. To convince. To convince. To persuade someone or make someone certain. For example, I hope this will convince you to change your mind. To abbreviate. To abbreviate. To shorten a word or words, or to make something shorter. As in, we had to abbreviate the names of the states. And finally, subtle. Subtle. If something is subtle, it is not loud, not bright, not noticeable, or not obvious in any way. As in, the room was painted a subtle shade of pink. In previous episodes of this podcast, I have stressed the importance of reading in improving your English ability. Reading can help improve your vocabulary, help you understand sentence structure, and most importantly, reading is fun. However, perhaps you have noticed that there are many different styles of writing out there. From simple airport fiction to Shakespeare's plays and Victorian poetry. Reading different styles of writing can be really confusing. Different styles of writing have types of vocabulary, different commonly used grammar, and different ways of making sentences. And this can make reading really difficult. One of the strangest styles of writing has been called journalese or tabloidese, or in simpler terms, the language of journalists. So for the rest of this episode, I will use the word journalese to refer to the language of newspapers and journalists. Newspapers are an excellent source of reading material. There are thousands published every day, with countless articles in different dialects of English and ranging from simple tabloids designed for anyone to read, all the way to broadsheet and financial newspapers, which write at an advanced level or university graduate level. The more you read English newspapers, the more you will realize that the way journalists write is not the same style that you might find in your textbook or in a novel. Let me give you an example that was highlighted in an Economist article about newspaper language a few years back. In 2018, around 60 Palestinian people were killed by Israeli soldiers during a confrontation in the Gaza Strip. The New York Times headline, in response to this killing, was "Dozens of Palestinians have died in protests as the US prepares to open its Jerusalem embassy." Now, at first, this might not seem like a strange headline to you. I'm going to read it one more time, and let's see if you can find the issue. Dozens of Palestinians have died in protests as the US prepares to open its Jerusalem embassy. Well, the issue I and many others have with this kind of headline can be summed up in this question. What did they die from? Old age? Sickness? Famine? Drought? By writing in the passive voice, or in this case, using an intransitive verb, die, which is often confused with the passive voice, the New York Times was reporting news, but at the same time, avoiding accusing anyone of a crime or wrongdoing. Think about the difference between these two sentences. Soldiers kill dozens of protesters, and dozens of protesters killed by soldiers. They describe the same thing, but they have very different feelings. And this use of passive voice, as well as other forms of journalese, is very common throughout journalism. At school and university, we are often taught to only use passive voice when necessary. Journalism does the opposite. Newspaper headlines can also be very confusing to non-native speakers, at least at first. This is because, especially in tabloids, headlines need to be short and eye-catching. An example like "Employees blast bosses" could easily be a tabloid headline. And again, at first, it seems like a perfectly normal sentence. It has a subject, a verb, and an object. But it doesn't really mean anything. It is intentionally vague. You need to read the article to find out what the journalist is reporting. Employee, blast, and boss all have meanings in English, of course, but together, we don't really know what they're talking about. This vagueness can sometimes result in headlines being ambiguous or having two possible meanings. Take this famous example: "Stolen painting found by tree." As the journalist chose to write passively, there are two possible meanings to this headline. The incorrect meaning is "a tree found a stolen painting." Now, Of course, a tree cannot find a painting. It's not a real human. It cannot find something. But it is possible for that sentence, that headline, to have that meaning. The correct meaning is someone found a stolen painting next to a tree. So why does Journalese exist? Space. A lot of reasons come down to space, especially in a headline. When you only have a limited space to write a headline, which will convince a reader to look at your article, journalists will try to put as much exciting information as possible into a short space. And often, grammar and vocabulary suffer the consequences. Newspaper articles and other forms of popular media often use over-abbreviated and unnatural language. This obsession with space even applies to the letters journalists choose to use. M and W are annoying for journalists, as they are wider than most other letters. While, for example, the letter I is narrow and perfect. For that reason, you may notice that newspaper articles don't often use long words, or words with lots of M's and lots of W's, unless it is very necessary. Short words that are full of meaning are very useful. Rise, for example, is better than growth. Bid is better than attempt. Space is not the only reason for journalese. Journalists also try to be as exciting as possible. They want everyone to read their articles and buy their newspapers. Therefore, newspaper articles often use more exciting words than we would use in our real conversations. Rant is a more exciting alternative to talk, or agony is more exciting than sad or pain. Furthermore, journalism uses many cliches. Now, I've mentioned cliches before in the George Orwell episode, which I'll link to in the description and in the blog. Cliches are overused expressions or phrases, and Orwell certainly didn't like cliches. To him, they are uninteresting and boring. Good writing should never use cliches, or should invent its own. However, because cliches are so overused, most people understand them straight away. Journalism isn't supposed to be difficult to read, and cliches are an effective way to communicate information quickly. So, when you read the newspapers, be prepared to find lots of cliches. Robert Hutton has described the language newspapers use as the strange language of the news. And I think this is quite appropriate. He says that journalists love talking to us in a language that most of us don't actually speak. In his book, he explains some of the phrases that are only used by journalists and explains how newspapers try to make stories interesting for all of their readers. For example, a newspaper from Scotland will normally include some connection to Scotland in their major articles, while a newspaper from Beijing will try to connect the same story to Beijing. There are many phrases and expressions only used in newspapers, or overly used in newspapers, but not often in conversations. I can't list them all here, obviously, but I'll include a few. In the language of journalese, temperatures soar, costs skyrocket, fires rage, and rivers rampage. Projects are kicked off, opponents weigh in. Buildings are slated for demolition, or perhaps they are tagged. In Journalese, people get a go-ahead and projects get a green light. Hopefully, this shows you a few examples of phrases and vocabulary that you might see in a newspaper, but you probably won't hear when talking to your friends. So, is the language used by journalists bad? Well, it definitely has critics. First, as mentioned before, Journalese is cliched. Journalists will use the same expressions, phrases, and metaphors for years or even decades. Perhaps readers would like some more interesting styles of writing instead. Second, lazy writing can encourage lazy thinking. Journalists don't have a lot of space. They want to make their articles as interesting as possible, and they want to sell as many newspapers as possible. This means that often articles have to be controversial. However, the world is often more subtle than newspapers would suggest. For example, political articles in newspapers often ask for politicians to resign if they commit some kind of faux pas or wrongdoing. But in the real world, maybe resigning is not the right option. But in the journalism world, resigning sells newspapers. Third, why not just write in normal English? I think it would be better. Journalese has often been described as a sign of a bad story. A good story or a good article doesn't need strange language to be interesting. And finally, although the language of journalism started as a way of simplifying writing, it is now less clear and more complicated than normal English. On the other hand, are there any good points for Journalese? Well, when there is not much space, it is quite effective. Especially in headlines, the strange language of journalism is often necessary. Second, although it's not always clear, Journalese is exciting. It can make articles more interesting to read, which, for many people, is the reason they buy that newspaper. And finally, Journalese is familiar. Once you have read enough newspapers, you will be able to quickly learn how to read and understand the language they use. And they are also consistent. So articles about politics will use the same political metaphors and expressions and cliches for years on end. Same as articles about sport, or articles about the economy, or articles about celebrities. If you read this type of article, you will learn the journalese vocabulary and expressions and sentence structures and grammar. And that way you will always be able to read this kind of article. So here is my final thought. There are many styles of writing, and it is important for English learners to understand how different formats use different vocabulary, grammar, and sentence structure. Newspapers use a strange language, which we don't normally use in real life. But learning and understanding it will make it a lot easier to read articles. And reading articles is good, it's interesting. Whether you think the language is bad, good, or confusing, Journalese can be influential. For example, the phrases mad cow disease and test tube baby started in newspapers, but they are now commonly used. They have entered our everyday vocabulary. Can you think of any examples of Journalese? Or have you ever seen a strange newspaper headline, or maybe a strange phrase in a newspaper? Reach out to me on Instagram and let me know. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Thinking in English. Please share with your friends, check out our social media links in the description, and send us a message. We really appreciate all of your feedback. And if you have any ideas for topics or future podcast guests or any other learning format, please let us know. And please leave me a rating. We're now on Instagram. I'm sure you've already seen it, but go there, check it out. Lots of good content about vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar. And Instagram is a great way to contact me. It's Thinking in English Podcast on Instagram, or the link is in the description. Also, all of the transcripts of the podcast are now available on the Thinking in English blog. Vocabulary list, comprehension questions, and all of the articles are there for you to read. That link is also in the description, so please check it out too. Thank you, and see you next time.